Hey everyone, I'm here today with a review of a more recent mystery novel, and a Japanese one at that, so a little bit different. I've heard that there's a lot of good Japanese mystery writing inspired by the golden age of detective fiction, although I'll admit I haven't done a lot of research on that front, and this one is probably further from that than some of the older works, but I think it was still a good example of the puzzle mystery novel with a different setting and a slightly different feel to it than some of the Agatha Christie mysteries I've been reading. The book is The Devotion of Suspect X, written by Keigo Higashino, who I heard about from Rincey of the channel Rincey Reads, and kind of just decided to check out on a whim one morning. Compared with something like, say, an Agatha Christie novel, the book for me had a somewhat more somber tone, and maybe felt a little bit darker because the characters felt just a little bit more real than in a Christie novel. Although, as I'll mention later, I think at times this creates some problems where the author fails to choose between character development and creation of suspense in a way that I think undermines his characters a little bit. This book also didn't feel as thoroughly cynical as I might expect of a typical crime noir novel. The setting and overall tone of the book is, I'd say, one of its strongest points, with descriptions that really placed me on a sort of chilly, overcast day, walking along down the path alongside the river and just musing to myself, occasionally stopping in a shop or an apartment along the side to investigate. Where the overall tone fell short for me was in this whole backdrop of framing the investigation as sort of an unsolvable math problem, which I'll get to a bit more later, but I might have to put that in the spoilery section. The format of investigation in this novel is interesting too, because we're told in the first few chapters what the crime was and who committed it, and then we jump ahead to the point where the body is found by the detectives dumped in the river. So the mystery is not who killed the man, but rather how exactly the cover-up after that was executed. And we're working alongside the detectives to piece this all together, because we weren't told what happened in between. We also will almost definitely be quite sympathetic to the murderers, a woman Yatsuko and her daughter Misato, who together killed Yatsuko's ex-husband, a man who was basically repeatedly harassing them, showing up to their apartment, and sort of implicitly asking for money and threatening the mother that he would start harassing her daughter if she didn't give in. We might have more mixed feelings, however, about their next-door neighbor Ishigami, a sort of mathematical genius who hears the commotion on the night of the murder, figures out right away what has happened, and offers to help devise the perfect cover-up for the crime. Because his motives are more murky. We're told that he has a crush on this woman Yasuko, but he also seems more than a little bit creepy because he's never interacted with her much or even made much real effort to. I mean, he shows up at her sandwich shop and doesn't say anything to her but just orders a sandwich. Yeah. And yet at the same time, this feels a little bit understandable because he seems like a lonely guy, shy, not the best at interacting with people. So we get the sense that maybe he really has been trying to get to know his neighbor, but is just utterly at a loss of how best to achieve this. For the investigation itself, we follow the lead detective on the case, Kusanagi, and his sort of sidekick, Kishitani. Neither of these men is entirely incompetent, as we often see the police in these Agatha Christie cases, but neither of them is especially clever either, and it's doubtful that they will be able to solve the case without the help of Professor Yukawa, or Professor Galileo as they call him, a physicist at the university who happens to be friends with Kusanagi and occasionally helps him with cases through these sort of informal consultations. Yukawa also happens, though, to be friends with our accomplice Ishigami, which leads to some interesting interactions and to the main tension of the story as the two geniuses battle to outwit one another while still maintaining a seemingly authentic respect for one another. The novel certainly wasn't perfect, but I found it quite entertaining. I'm not necessarily committed yet to going out and reading everything Higashino's written, since there were definitely some aspects of this book that I found lacking. But for having an overall suspenseful mystery without resorting to cheap thrills, well, mostly without them, I think this book deserves a lot of credit. I also can't really say how original this framing is of being told the murderer right away and then following the detectives as they try to figure out what happened. I suspect this is hardly the first time it's been done, but this certainly isn't what happens in the golden age of mystery novels that I've been reading lately, so for me, it was a refreshing change of pace. It maybe lost just a little bit of its novelty there because this framing is similar to the framing of the movie Knives Out, which I also reviewed on this channel in a sort of special feature movie review because I enjoyed it so much. But I think Knives Out ultimately was done in a way that worked better than The Devotion of Suspect X because it was easier for me to wholeheartedly throw my support behind at least one character in that movie. But all in all, I'd still recommend The Devotion of Suspect X as a novel worth reading if you like these sorts of mysteries, where part of the fun is figuring out what happened. Knowing who committed the crime so early on really didn't spoil that for me at all. I've said now what I liked about the novel, and there was a lot, but now I have to get into some of the aspects that I didn't like so much. And what I didn't like about this book came down in large part to the development of the central character Ishigami. Ishigami is potentially one of the most interesting characters in the book, but because of this, he's the kind of character that makes or breaks the story on a character level, and unfortunately, he's not a character that totally worked for me. And to say any more about that, I'm just going to have to give the spoiler warning and say spoilers ahead now, because I'm pretty much going to tell you everything you need to know about Ishigami, which is also going to tell you everything you need to know about the other characters too. So here's your cue if you need to take a break for a few minutes and go read that book, before coming back, of course, and watching the second half of the video. The author's portrayal of Ishigami in this novel alternates frequently between a lonely but generous man, a cold-hearted logician, and an obsessive stalker in a way that, unfortunately, by the end for me, rather than making him a relatable sort of complex and tortured soul, just made me not really believe him at all because he seemed inconsistently written. And maybe this could have worked better if we were able to observe him but never see inside his head, but since we do see inside his head quite often, it really just doesn't always all add up. In reading people talking about the book online, I saw a lot of people who genuinely seemed to admire Ishigami, and others who thought he was totally a monster. Actually, I was surprised that more people seemed to admire him than find him a monster, because for me, well, a monster is a bit of a strong word, but I think it's hard to forget the fact that we learned by the end that he killed an innocent homeless person to aid with the cover-up of Yasuko's separate murder of her ex-husband. But I'm not that surprised by this range of impressions, and in my opinion, unfortunately, rather than highlighting that Ishigami was a complex and well-written character, to me, it's more just an indication that he was an inconsistent character and that people had to pick some side of him. Because I think these readers who ultimately came down liking or disliking Ishigami rather than sort of having mixed feelings about him, as I think is more common with a well-written character of this sort, I think these readers quite possibly, like me, just had a hard time reconciling the different presentations of Ishigami that we were given, and were only really able to conceive of him as part of how he was written. And why is this? Well, I think that the author seems to have double-dipped at times with revealing Ishigami's personality to us readers. I've heard people discuss that this is an inherent tension that mystery writers are very familiar with, where the more you reveal about a character's actual personality, the less mysterious they become in terms of the mystery plot itself, because readers become better able to predict what they're going to do. Still, I like to think that it can be achieved better than it was here, or at least the trade-offs can be made in a way that better optimizes both personality and plot. Here, in his attempts to trick the reader for the sake of the mystery, the author seems to sort of present one convincing version of Ishigami, but then take it back in a way that ultimately just feels inconsistent by the end. For example, we learn around the middle of the book that, as we've maybe been suspecting for a while, Ishigami seems to be kind of a full-blown stalker. At least as it appears, he's holding this knowledge of Yasuko's guilt over her head to control what she does and prevent her from seeing this other man, an old and kind-hearted friend, Mr. Kudo. But then no, apparently he isn't. This was just part of his ploy to convince the police that he was a stalker, even though he's not. But is he really not a stalker? Like, among other things, he supposedly has a device that he can use to listen through walls, which to me seems like it's being suggested that this is actually how he figured out what was going on next door in the first place on the day of the crime. Because I was never buying for a minute that no matter how smart he is, that he just walked next door and could tell right away that a murder had taken place based on some stuff that he saw in the room. This level of observational smarts, as it's portrayed in this scene, just completely defies belief. So it seems to me that he actually is a stalker, and he's certainly obsessed. But then this too is kind of dismissed by the end as just part of the act. So we're left here not so much with a complicated character as with a character who just seems inconsistently portrayed. And unfortunately, instead of being able to understand Ishigami in the end on a sort of emotional level, like to understand how it feels to, I guess, be a stalker, as it sort of turns out, or in some way obsessed with this woman, his neighbor, instead his inconsistent feelings are tossed around through the novel for us to try hopelessly to understand in a way that ultimately adds suspense for the reader, I will admit, but it's all at the expense of his strength as a character. Similarly, even once it was totally 100% confirmed how this all happened, I'm just not sure I can buy into the idea that this guy killed a homeless person to achieve his ends. Now, you could say that the passages implying Ishigami actually has some heart to him, some sense of compassion, are just intended to mislead. I'm talking, for example, about the very first passage of the book, in which he observes the people at the homeless encampment in a way that, even rereading it after knowing how it all turns out, strongly seems to me to convey a genuinely empathetic interest in their experiences, a sort of admiration and respect for them, and not just a scoping out of which of them would make a good body if he happens to need to obfuscate a murder. Sure, you can make these arguments about how that's not how it really is. The thing is, we're seeing inside his head, we're seeing his thoughts, and even after reading it through again, the tone just isn't consistent with how Ishigami is portrayed later in the book, when he really is portrayed as more coldly rational and lacking this deeper empathy. I just don't really buy that the Ishigami we're seeing in this first scene is the same one we'll be seeing later in the book, or if it is possible that these could simply be two sides or dimensions of the same person, that gap was not sufficiently bridged in the writing for me to really believe it. On another note, the portrayal of Ishigami was also quite lacking to me as an actual mathematician. I like reading the characters of math geniuses when they have something new or genuinely interesting to bring to the table, but Ishigami was not really convincing as a math genius. To me, it seemed that the author wanted to create a math genius as a character, but is not actually a mathematician himself, and only did some research or discuss problems he'd already heard of before. His biography on Wikipedia, at least, says that he got a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. So I can't really speak to his entire experience as a mathematician or a scientist, but I think the writing reveals that this is not a world that he's currently immersed in. Like, he's discussing problems that pretty much anyone who's taken a college course in these subjects will have heard of before, which unfortunately results in a character that, if you've heard of these things before, is entirely unbelievable as a mathematician, let alone as the smartest student in the university in like 50 years. The few real math problems that are mentioned are, as one commenter on Reddit pointed out, and I'll link their review below, they're not the problems that an actual mathematician would be thinking about, but rather the things that a member of the general public who's not a mathematician has heard of and would imagine that a mathematician might be thinking about. We hear, for example, about the map coloring problem, the Riemann hypothesis, and the P equals NP problem, which are all fairly well-known problems, and then on a few other occasions we just hear about that other math problem he'd been working on in this hand-wavy sort of way, as if the author has given up even trying to convince himself that this guy is a real mathematician. And I hate to be persnickety here, but the repeated references to the P equals NP problem were complete gobbledygook and really suggested to me that the author doesn't know the math that he's talking about here. And like, I wouldn't harp on this, but the problem is explicitly framed and brought up multiple times as a problem that's analogous to the mystery itself. And at one point, the math genius Ishigami reflects for the reader's benefit on how this problem is the problem of proving that it's as easy to verify a solution to a problem as to come up with a solution in the first place, which is in some way supposed to parallel Ishigami's devising of a solution to this problem of covering up a murder, and the question of whether the detectives will be able to determine that this solution is actually invalid, so to speak. Now, maybe in some context this framing could have worked, but from the very start he just got the whole thing backwards, because the P equals NP problem, setting aside the understandably oversimplified explanation in the novel, is not to determine whether it's easier to verify a solution than to solve a problem. Because it is. That's a solved problem. The P equals NP problem is to determine, for this certain type of problems, whether problems where a proposed solution can be verified are actually as easy to solve if you don't have the solution. Okay, I'm getting too much into the technical details, but it was supposed to imply that the detectives would never be able to keep up with Ishigami because he could just keep churning out solutions faster than the detectives could verify them. But it ironically implied the exact opposite, that it would be very easy to catch Ishigami. And you know, I'm not actually as picky about this as I'm seeming right now. I was almost willing to let it slide earlier on when I heard this, if the author had then managed to use it really cleverly, but he didn't. It just felt unnecessary and just there to characterize a stereotypically math-minded character. It did eventually bother me when he just kept hitting us over the head with it again and again, along with all these other, like, surface level math explanations that he's giving. All right, changing courses a bit. Detective Yukawa was a fun character for me. Actually, the whole detective team was pretty good. Yukawa seemed like quite a jerk in many ways, but also with a human, compassionate side to him in a way that really fits the role for this sort of story. Yasuko was fine, but kind of got shafted a bit by later on in the novel in favor of Ishigami's attention. Her daughter Masato was, for me, not a great character. She kind of fades into the background until she's used to add some shock value in the last 10 minutes as it's revealed that she's attempted suicide. No surprise, really, given that her mom's like completely ignored her lately. But this just wasn't necessary within the rest of the novel because, like I said, the author has devoted all of his attention to Ishigami, so Masato has been an afterthought up to here. Now, the twist at the end in when the murder took place, it was good. I liked it, and I think in some ways it was definitely conveniently concealed to the reader to keep it from standing out. But I think overall, aside from the character development issues that I think were introduced to keep it from becoming obvious too soon, like not being able to see some of the confusion of Yasuko and Masato as they didn't really understand what was going on either. Aside from that, I think it was a pretty well executed mystery. Some people didn't like the way the investigation went because they thought it was silly that all the attention was focused on Yasuko and Masato, but that didn't really bother me too much. I think they're probably right, but I was willing to suspend disbelief on that front, just for the sake of an interesting story and investigation. But the resolution of this novel also felt rushed and kind of a mess. I don't mean Professor Yukawa's revelation of how Ishigami pulled off this cover-up, which I really did find kind of clever, but rather everything else that happened after that. Kudo's sudden and seemingly very early marriage proposal to Yasuko, the news that Yasuko's daughter has attempted suicide for reasons that aren't totally clear and won't be clear ever, the full explanation of what Yasuko and Misato really meant to Ishigami, supposedly. I'm not going to say that the final few pages of this book were bad. I certainly think the way things turned out at this point was fine, given everything leading up to this point, but I wasn't exactly erupting into applause by the end either. The final resolution was simply okay for me, a little bit overdone. So that's the devotion of Suspect X. I hope my criticism of Ishigami as a character didn't overpower the sentiment that I really did overall enjoy this novel and would recommend it for fans of the genre. I'm certainly interested in your opinions too, though, especially if you feel very differently than me about Ishigami as a character, so definitely leave me a comment with your own perspectives if that was the case. I probably will take on another of Higashino's works at some point, though I'm also interested in casting my net more widely, so I'm not sure if I'll get to it right away. And that's a wrap, so happy reading.